Okie doke. So at this stage, we should pretty much be up to chapter 4, chapter 5. Ideally, that's where you're going to be. If you're a little bit behind there, not a big deal, but try and catch up. Chapter 5 is sort of the first big chapter that you're going to jump into. So just as a review of where we've been so far, we've had chapter 1, which is kind of just a real quick recap about state of the PV industry, some of the history, some of the certification programs, some of the approved markings, like UL, ETL, those kind of things. Then cells and solar panels, chapter 2. The big takeaway there is to talk about STC, standard test conditions. Also, what are the points along the IV curve that we need to understand? You don't necessarily have to know how to calculate these because they're given to you, but you should understand what they mean. So the primary ones, of course, VOC, which is the theoretical maximum voltage the system might operate under, and ISC, the amp short circuit, which is the theoretical maximum amps. We use both of those numbers when we're designing our system so that we're designing it based on worst case scenario. That so the voltage is not allowed to exceed 600 volts for residential systems. I think it's 1,000 volts for commercial rooftop. Might be 1,500. I always get those confused because there's the European one. I think it's 1,000 though. And then ground mounted systems in a commercial environment, they're kind of unlimited. But when we're designing for those, we want to make sure that we don't exceed those. So we use VOC. And then ISC we use when we're sizing the wire just to make sure we don't exceed that. Then we have the VMP and the IMP, which are the voltage and amps at the maximum power point. These are operational amps and volts. And the reason they're operational is because we have a thing called the MPPT, the maximum power point tracking device, that sets the sweet spot for everything to operate at. It's always checking environmental conditions, and we're going to be operating at the maximum power point for those environmental conditions. Primary ones are irradiance, the amount of sunlight hitting the panels. That mostly affects amps. And then the temperature, which mostly affects voltage. So that MPPT is moving the panel along that IV curve based on millisecond to millisecond environmental conditions. So that's kind of the major takeaway out of chapter 2. Then we get into chapter 3, the different types of PV systems. So we have our typical, just a standard old grid-tied system. When you're hearing prices and the like, when we say it's $3 a watt, $2.50 a watt, they're typically talking about standard grid-tied systems with no battery backup. If the grid goes down, your system goes down because of the anti-islanding issue. So as soon as it loses sight of the grid, you've got to be able to disconnect from the grid so you're not pumping power back onto it and perhaps kill a lineman who thinks the grid is not operational. So that's a standard grid-tied system. But the downfall of that system, or the negative part, is that when the grid goes down, you don't have power. So then you've got an option. You can say, all right, I'm going to do an AC coupled or a DC coupled system where if the grid goes down, it has to have a smart switch, an auto disconnector, an auto transformer that disconnects you physically from the grid. So you cannot island, you cannot send power back to the grid. And then I'm operating in standalone mode. The AC coupled system is designed where if the power is coming to the system in AC form, then that's an AC coupled system. Normally, typically, that's going to be microinverters. They're connected directly to the panel. They're generating AC power. DC coupled system conceptually is exactly the same thing, except you're getting DC power from the panel. It goes to the inverter and it goes to the battery. So it doesn't have to go through multiple steps. With an AC coupled, it's got to go from the DC at the panel to the AC at the inverter. Then it's got to be changed from AC to DC to charge the battery. And then from the battery, it's got to be converted from DC to AC. So there's a lot of multiple steps in there, and that always adds inefficiency. DC system goes DC from the panel to the battery to the inverter, and then it goes from DC to AC. So there's really just the one conversion. So if you're building a new system, it might be appealing to do a DC coupled system. If you're retrofitting an existing system, well, then you got to go with an AC system. But with microinverters, because the efficiency transfer has gotten so good, like a 1% each time that conversion takes place, we're seeing increasingly people designing from the ground up as an AC coupled system. And then there's the most expensive option, which is the one that Christy, who disappeared, has opted for, which is standalone. And in their case, they're doing it because the grid is simply not available. If the grid were available, I think if I remember Christy saying it was like 50,000 or 30,000 to connect to the grid. So you say, well, you know what? Why would I give that kind of money to the utility company? I'll just build my own system. So that's increasingly becoming a thing. But it's definitely the most expensive of those options. All right, so that brings us up to chapter 4. So chapter 4, we get into basic electrical concepts. So I guess I'm assuming this course assumes you have zero electrical background. That could be a fair assumption, or it could be, not. And so if it's not a fair assumption, then chapter 4 should be review or just, easy for you. So there are a couple of formulas that come out of chapter 4 that you guys need to memorize. These are really the only formulas for the exam that are required to be memorized. Let me jump in here, and I'm going to put the whiteboard in. I have 2 different whiteboards, and I like the one that when I share the screen, it gives me a whiteboard option as opposed to the other one. Yeah, so the three equations, the first one's pretty straightforward. It's watts equals amps times volts. That's the power equation. Oftentimes electricians will do the same equation, but they'll just say pi. Power equals amps times electromotive force. It's exactly the same equation, just different terminologies. But, you get that cutesy little thing about electricians love pi and, whatever. So it's easier to remember, but it really is exactly the same thing. We typically in the solar industry talk about watts and amps and volts as opposed to power and electromotive force. The other equation is Ohm's law. So Ohm's law is, I just usually just tell myself VER, volts equals amps times resistance. Very similar kind of thing. In all of these equations, you got to know 2 of the variables in order to figure out the third one. So if you know 2 of these, you're gonna be able to calculate the third one. Really, the only significance of this is to understand there is a relationship between volts, amps, and resistance. So the third equation that you've got to know is the voltage drop equation. And it is just a variation of Ohm's law. It's volts, or voltage drop, equals amps. And in this case, it's usually the amps at the maximum power point, because we're talking about solar panels, times resistance. But we get the resistance in the NEC in ohms per 1,000 feet. So now we've got to adjust for distance. So times twice the distance divided by 1,000 feet. And all that is taking the resistance that we're given. So when the NEC says, for instance, number 10 stranded copper cable is 1.24 ohms per 1,000 feet. If I plug in 1.24 ohms here for resistance, I need to know what portion of 1,000 feet it is, because that's just how it was given to me. Twice the distance, because in any circuit, there's the distance to it and there's the distance from it. So it's a circuit. So if from one location to the other, it's 200 feet, then twice the distance would be 400 feet divided by 1,000. So it'd be 0.4, right? 400 divided by 1,000. And if the amps on the solar panel, on that string, let's say it was 8.64 amps. And I got that off of just one of the panels for a single string. Because if I've got, let's say, I don't know, four panels, they're all identical, and I look at the VM or the IMP equals 8.64, and I've connected these things together in a string, what happens with amps? Right? When I'm hooking things up in series, so this would be positive and this would be negative and that'd be positive and that'd be negative. When you hook it up in series, volts increase, but amps remain the same, right? So if I hook up 4 of them in a string, the amps of the string is 8.64. It's the same as a single panel. I could hook up 10, I could hook up 30, I could hook up 100. The amps is not going to change as long as I'm hooking them up in a string. So the amps of one panel is going to be the amps of the string, just by definition. So what would be the voltage drop in an equation like this? Well, if you have a calculator, I happen to have a calculator right here, an illegal one because it's my phone, so I wouldn't be able to use it in the test, times 1.24 times 0.4, and I'm getting 4.28544. So voltage drop is 4.3 more or less volts over that circuit, over that distance. So is that acceptable? All right. I'll see if anybody thinks it is. You're allowed to respond on this. So is it acceptable? I'll pick on Bailey since everybody's being quiet. Bailey, is that an acceptable voltage drop? You're muted, so there you go.
I think it is. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, well, the answer to almost every question I'll ever ask is it depends, right? What's the voltage of the system? Well, if the voltage of the system is 600 volts DC and we're losing 4.28 volts, well, that's less than 1%. So that's definitely acceptable because we want to keep our voltage drop ideally below 2%, but they say in the range of 2 to 5%. You can never get away with zero. You're always going to have some voltage drop. All right. What if the voltage of this system was 12 volts? Well, 4.28 volts divided by 12. Well, now we're up around 40%, right? So we've just lost 40% of our power. Is that acceptable? Not at all. So how do you minimize voltage drop? What are your choices? Well, one of the choices clearly is to increase the voltage of the system. And we have limitations. We're not allowed to go over 600 volts if it's a residential system. but that is an option. And it's usually a good option. The higher the voltage, the less loss we're going to have. What's another option?
Thicker wire gauge or a shorter run.
Yeah, shorter run or bigger wire, right? Well, if you're already designing your system, ideally your system will be designed with the shortest possible runs. That's just good design. So it may be that 200 feet away is just what it is. You've got a solar array out in the middle of a field. That's where it's got to be. So that's gonna, we can't change that, but we can certainly change the size of the wire. In this case, we're picking number 10 AWG. But what would be the impact if we decided to change to 4-aught? So 4-aught wire. In your book, trying to think which page, the resistance characteristics, for some reason 80 something.
Right off the bat, it's a thicker wire, so that means it has less resistance, which means it would be more acceptable.
Yeah, so on page 84, if I look at 4-aught, then the resistance of that is not going to be 1.24. It's going to be 0.0608. All right, so all other things being equal, we would take 8.64 times 0.0608 times 0.4, and we get 0.2101. All right. So now instead of losing 4 volts, 4.3 volts, we're losing 0.2 volts over the course. Well, once again, it depends. If it's a 12-volt system, is this adequate? 210, I think we're just barely there. I divide that by 12, and it's 1.75%. All right, so we made it, 1.75%. That's acceptable, but at what cost? I mean, if you figure that 4-aught wire costs $3 a linear foot for each strand of wire, that might be cheap in today's market, I'm not sure. And you're going to need a positive and a negative. So that's $6 per foot times 200 feet. 1,200 for that versus, maybe for 10 gauge wire, 200 feet is going to be about, I don't know, let's just say $100 for 2 rolls, 100 foot. It's going to be significantly more expensive. Plus, if you've ever worked with 4-aught wire, it's going to be difficult to pull, difficult to terminate, difficult. So not a good solution, not a good solution. And I suspect that 1,200 is going to be closer to, say, 2,000 by the time you're all done. So not a good solution. So how do you deal with this? Well, one thing we can do, let me get rid of some of this. Woohoo. Is I know when I first started teaching solar years ago, your alternative was we could increase, of course, the voltage of the system, but if we're dealing with a standalone system, then our only choice was up to the maximum allowable battery voltage in our system. Well, we said that the solar array can be 600 volts, but the battery system can only be 50 volts. So what we found is most of our standalone systems were either 12 volt, 24 volt, 36 volt, or 48 volt nominal. So these were our choices. And as a matter of course, the 36 volt was kind of not used. So you were either 12, 24, or 48. So those were your choices. So as a result, most people, they just centered on 48 volt systems. That was the normal standalone system. It still is in some of the inverter specifications, things of that nature. So if I had a solar array where it was like here, and I had the first thing we're going to go to is your combiner box. And from the combiner box, we're going to go to a DC disconnect. And from the DC disconnect, normally they're attached. This is going to be our inverter. Oops, nope. I'm building a grid tied system here. From our DC disconnect, it's going to go to a charge controller. From the charge controller, I'm going to go to a battery bank. From the battery bank, normally we'd put another DC disconnect in there, but I'm going to go to the inverter. And then from the inverter, we're going to go to our loads. And that's your main, and it can function as an AC disconnect as well. All right, so this would be a typical standalone system. Well, we've been told that the battery bank can only be 48 volts maximum. And that's from the NEC. So all of our components have to match. So I need a nominal 48 volt inverter. And I need a nominal 48 volt charge controller. And I need a nominal 48 volt array. So that was the design criteria. Well, where does that get us into trouble? If we look at voltage drop, let's say that the distance here is it's a ground mounted system. So let's just say it's 150 feet from here all the way to the equipment down in here. And if I want to use 12 gauge or 10 gauge wire, which is sort of our standard wire, let's say that our voltage drop is the IMP, and I'm going to say it's 9 amps times resistance, 1.24 ohms, times twice the distance, so 300 feet divided by 1,000 times 0.3. So what is our voltage drop? It's 9 times 1.24 times 0.3. 3.87 volts. All right. So voltage drop equals 3.87 volts. Well, 3.87 divided by 48, which is the system's nominal voltage, is going to be 7%. So I've just lost 7% of my output. So Christy's designing this system for her house. She just spent $30,000 on her system. And just because of voltage drop, she's lost 7%. So that cost her $2,100 just because of voltage drop in value. So what's an alternative? Well, we can use bigger wire. That's going to cost money. We can increase the system voltage, or we can shorten the distance. Well, we can't really increase, or we can't shorten the distance. Let's assume that's where it has to be. It used to be the only choice was to increase the wire size, and that was going to cost a lot of money. But then somebody came up with what they called, unfortunately, an MPPT charge controller. But it was basically a buck boost charge controller. And what that means is the charge controller comes in up to 600 volts, and then it does a DC to DC voltage conversion within the charge controller, and it steps down the voltage to 48 nominal. So now we can do our array up to 600 volts. So what does that do to our system? Well, instead of 3.87 volts divided by 48, it can be 3.87 volts divided by 600. 3.87 divided by 600. And now we're down to 0.6%. So less than 1%. So that is a good solution. And it turns out these MPPT charge controllers don't really cost more money than the old charge controllers. So this is going to be your solution. You're going to put in a buck boost charge controller or an MPPT charge controller. The reason I don't like the term MPPT is, remember, the MPPT is the maximum power point transfer. So that's keeping this operating at the sweet spot. Well, every charge controller has an MPPT built into it. So calling this an MPPT charge controller is confusing because they all have it. Plus, just to make you confused even more, it's still a pulse width modulating charge controller. So it hasn't changed. It's just got this marketing buzzword of MPPT attached to it. It basically is what they call a buck boost charge controller. Comes in at one voltage, leaves at another, either up or down. So I don't know. Did I confuse anybody, or does that all make sense? Wait for your. Okay.
So it's a charge controller plus.
Yeah, it's basically you can come in at 1
2.0.
voltage. Yeah, 2.0. And when they first came out, it was a big deal. They said you can come in at 150 volts and leave at 48 or 12 or 24. And it was a big deal. Then about 6 months later, they said, hey, we've refined it, and now you can come in at 250, leave at 12, 24, 48. Then another 6 months, and it was suddenly 600 volts. So that's really where we needed to be anyway, coming in at up to 600, because that's what your array can be configured at. And so now it's really, for any size system, it's almost hard not to find an MPPT charge controller, because why would you buy anything else? It's just what you're going to buy. They don't really even sell, except for very small systems. Like you can find 12-volt charge controllers for $15, if you're building a solar generator. But for a home, your system, and I think, Christy, the system you were looking at, I know I suggested Solarc as an option, but I think Chad found something cheaper, and
Yeah.
you're going to live to regret it probably, but
I hope not.
yeah, I don't know. I don't have any sense of whether it's a good one or a bad one or indifferent. But it's definitely less expensive than Solarc. For most residential standalone systems that I've been involved with, people end up going with Solarc. It's because it's the leading seller. It's just the brand. Okay, so everybody clear about voltage drop? Those are the three equations that you're going to have to take away from the electrical. And then there's the concept of bonding and grounding. And bonding and grounding is a strange beast. If you're getting an electrical inspection, if you get dinged on anything in your installation, it's going to be on bonding and grounding. And the reason for that is because that's the thing the electrical inspectors understand. They don't understand solar. So they're just going to find something. And that seems to be, they made the trip out there. They got to find something, So sometimes when I'm doing systems, I like to leave something for the inspector to find, just to keep them happy. So leave something that's easy to fix, so they can get all kind of grumpy and say, you know what, you didn't terminate this thing properly. And you go, oh boy, good catch, man. yeah, let me do it right now, that kind of stuff or whatever. So, and other times, I mean, I've had people report that the inspector shows up and doesn't even look at the system, just says, is everything fine? You say, yeah. And he goes, okay, where's the paperwork? Let me sign off on it. So, especially if it involves climbing up on a roof, because they don't want to do that at all, So that's that our system's broken. What can I say? Okay, so that's the electrical. Any questions from chapter 4 that you ran into as you were wandering through? I think the water analogy of electricity is a good one. Amps is the size of the pipe. Volts is the pressure under which it operates. And watts is just how much water is flowing through that pipe at any given moment. So higher the pressure, smaller the pipe, you can adjust the two and still have the same amount of water. So, all right. So the parts, chapter 5, parts of the system. So what I've done here, just organizationally, I like to try and compartmentalize these things. So I work from the panel all the way down to the load. So that's kind of the process we work at. So how do you select a solar panel? Normally you're going to be basing this based on other people's recommendation, based on price. One thing that people get confused about is when you go to buy your product, you typically will not buy it from a manufacturer. You're only going to be going through existing distributors. You're just not big enough to work directly with the manufacturer. So if you're working with a trusted distributor, they're going to give you a quality panel. You can pretty much assume they're going to make that determination for you. So if they're offering it for sale, it's probably okay, as long as you trust the distributor. Because they don't want to deal with quality issues. They don't want to deal with returns. They don't want to deal with all that stuff. So, so at that point, you might just deal with price. I think panels are pretty generic. One quality panel is about the same as another. I don't get too bent on which one to buy, which one not to buy. They all seem to be pretty comparable. Again, there's cheap ones out there, but you wouldn't buy those through a reputable distributor. They've got to be UL certified, UL 1703. And there's a new number. I think it's in your book there, 6703. I'll have to look that up. Anyway, so 1703 was the number for years and years and years, and now they decided to internationalize it. Okay, so from the panel, on the back of the panel is the junction box. The junction box, and this gets into some of those terminologies where there are two different things, both of which are called junction boxes, just like there are two different things that are called panels. There's a solar panel, and then there's a service panel. The service panel is your circuit breaker box. That's your service panel. The junction box is that little plastic box that's glued to the back of your solar panel. That's where the connections to the solar panel are made. But then that can connect to another thing called a junction box. So that would be a separate box where a connection is made. Same in electrical. There are junction boxes used in electrical all the time. It's just a box where electrical connections are made, usually transitioning from one wire to another. The only difference between a junction box and a combiner box is in a combiner box, you're making connections in parallel. So in a junction box, you're just taking one wire, connecting it to a similar wire, and then leading on out. So no parallel connections are being made. Increasingly, we're seeing people using junction boxes instead of combiner boxes because each string can then be individually controlled. There can be a separate MPPT for each string. If we combine them in parallel, you're basically the entire array is being operated as a single unit. So if one panel is shaded, it affects all of the panels in the array. If you keep the string separated all the way down to the inverter, then if one panel is shaded, it only affects that string. The other ones are unaffected. So they've decided that the better production from the array is worth more than the cost savings in wire by combining them. So that's your junction box, combiner box. Typically in a combiner box, you're going to have some sort of overcurrent protection. So overcurrent protection is fuses and breakers. You don't normally want to put overcurrent protection, though, in a junction box that's located on a roof under your solar panels. Because imagine that something happens and the breaker trips. Well, now you got to get up on the roof. You got to remove a panel. You got to open the junction box. You got to reset the breaker. It's just not practical. So typically you'll move that overcurrent protection down somewhere where you can access it. It could be a fuse in an AC disconnect, or if you've got the combiner box down there next to the building, that's where it would be. In N-phase systems, for example, it's very, very common that you would have the system connected to a junction box. Then it runs in conduit down to what N-phase calls their combiner box. And this is where the branch circuits, because these are branch circuits, not strings, because everything's AC at that point. So they're coming into the combiner box, the N-phase combiner box. And the N-phase combiner box, let me just draw sort of a picture of it here. Oh, I've got still all that stuff. Clear all my drawings. Hey, there we go. That was easy. All right, so an N-phase combiner box typically is going to look something like this. It's a big case, and there are 4 double pole breakers. I think they're usually configured something like this. And each one of these can handle 20 amps. So I could come in with up to 4 branch circuits, and I could connect into these breakers. Now, each of these branch circuits can handle 13 IQ8 plus microinverters. So if I can do 4 of them, then I could have 13 times 4. That's going to be 52 panels, 52 inverters. So that's a pretty good size system. 52 of them. If I need more than that, I'm going to have to add a second combiner box. So that's the maximum. Because from here, there are these lugs at the bottom, and this is where you lead out with your line 1 and line 2, your HOTS. Then there's going to be like a neutral bus bar and a grounding bus bar. And those are going to lead out as well. And then that's going to go either to your AC disconnect. Well, it's going to go to your AC disconnect. That's going to be your next stop. And the AC disconnect needs to be located within 10 feet of your meter, outside, well marked, externally operable. So that's all going to go into this AC disconnect. And then from this AC disconnect, it's going to go in a very simple system. You would just simply have your service panel. So this is your main. Let's say it's 200 amp going out to your meter. And then this is just going to come in and connect to a double pole breaker right there. And if it's a single string, it's going to come in and just connect to, say, a 20 amp circuit breaker box, a circuit breaker box. Well, you've got a breaker here and you've got a breaker here. So that's your overcurrent protection. And in your AC disconnect, you might have a fuse. So that also is going to be overcurrent protection. But up on the roof, we're just going to go into a junction box. And then those are going to be under the solar panels. So that's a very, very simple N-phase system, microinverter system. The other thing that's built in here is there's a circuit board up here, and this is your communication system. And they call that their Envoy. And that's where all the communication happens. And it typically happens both Wi-Fi and cellular, so that it's communicating to the internet at that location. Now, what happens if we want to hook in battery backup? Well, suddenly this goes from a simple grid-tied system to an AC coupled system. Because under this scenario, the way this is run, if the grid goes down, my system shuts off, right? Because of islanding. But I want to set it up so that I actually have power if the grid goes down. So what I need to do is come in here, and I'm going to put in what's referred to as a smart switch. They've got another name for it, but it has a big transformer in here. It's a big piece of equipment. It's like $2,500. So your AC system is coming in here. And let's say I decide I don't need to run all of my loads. So I install a critical load panel. And then I need some batteries. So this is going to be my battery system. And it connects in here. And I could also connect in a generator if I wanted to. And it connects in here. So this is the brains of the operation now. And from here, it connects in to the critical load panel. And it also connects in to my main load panel. All right. So does everybody see here all the different connection points? And oh, there's one other thing that I have, and that's from here, I've got a second disconnect, and it's referred to as the rapid shutdown initiator. It's basically a DC disconnect. The reason you need to have that, and it's got to be out here located next to the AC disconnect by the meter. The reason we have that is, let's see what happens when the grid goes down. When the grid is operating, everything's live, everything's running through, and the power is coming in from the array. It can be charging the batteries, so it could go that way if it wants to. It can go to the loads. It can go to both of these loads. And if I have extra power, it's going to go off to the grid. So everything is connected and everything is powered. Now the grid gets disconnected, right? The grid goes down. So what happens? Well, we have to physically disconnect from the grid. How do we do that? Well, essentially, this connection point here gets shut off in the smart switch. All right, so it senses the grid is off and it disconnects from this service panel. Well, now everything is operating, but only to this critical load panel. We've got a generator, we've got batteries, we've got solar array. Everything is coming in, but it's only powering these critical loads. Now, as soon as it senses that the grid has reestablished itself, then it's going to go ahead and reestablish that connection. It usually has about a 5-minute wait or so, because sometimes, the grid comes on and the grid goes off. So you don't really want to have it popping on, popping off, popping on kind of thing. But as soon as it senses that the grid has now reestablished itself, it receives a signal, and then about 5 minutes later, it reestablishes that connection. So when the grid is operational, everything is running. When the grid goes down, it disconnects from that service panel, and now only these are coming. Well, what happens if your house is on fire and the grid went down because they came and they turned off the system? Well, the first thing they did is they pulled the meter. That shut off the grid. Then they turned off the array. So that turned off the power here, but now your batteries kick in or your generator kicks in because you still want power. The switch is still figuring out, yeah, okay, well, we're still going to power the loads. So there's still live lines in your house. Even though the first responders have pulled the meter and they pulled the AC disconnect. So then you've got to have a DC disconnect, this rapid shutdown initiator. As soon as they push that button, then essentially it turns off all power in your system. So everything is turned off. And that's the point of that. It's almost like a panic button out there. It just turns off your batteries, your generator, all loads. So really in this situation, there are 3 different switches that need to be turned off in order to ensure that there's no power going on anywhere in the house. And increasingly, they're not going to pull the meter anymore. The new code says there's got to be a utility disconnect panel here at your meter. It's usually just a little box that's added to the bottom, and it's got like a main breaker. And then typically there are going to be like 4 breakers underneath, 4 double pole breakers. And that's what your new electric meter box is going to look like. So instead of the guys coming in and pulling the meter, they're just going to open that up and turn off that breaker. And that becomes the main breaker for the house. Well, the nice thing about having something like this is if we were doing just a simple end-phase system, I could design it in such a way, if I don't have any of these batteries or generators or critical loads or any of that stuff, I could just simply go from my AC disconnect, and I could go straight in and connect into one of these double pole breakers right there. So imagine if you're installing a system, and let me clear this. So we've got a house here, a roof of a house. We've got the solar array up here. And I've gone ahead and put the junction box so it penetrates through the roof into the attic. Now this comes through the attic, and then I pop out the side of the building here in the attic, and I run down the side of the house. These are walls here. So I'm running down the side of the roof, and I go into a, I made that line a little bit long. There we go. All right, so I'm coming down here. Well, what's the next thing I go to is going to be my combiner box. So I'm going to connect in here to the combiner box. From the combiner box, I'm going to go to an AC disconnect. From the AC disconnect, I could just connect straight into that at the meter to this double pole breaker here. And I've never had to go inside the house. I never had to penetrate. Well, I had to go into the attic to do that. But I could even just run like liquid tight on the surface of the roof and come down the side of the wall if I didn't want to go into the building at all. The only problem is that's going to look kind of ugly up there on the roof because there's going to be wire exposed. But it's possible. It's a possibility there. And so now we haven't had to drill holes through the wall, go down into the basement. Oftentimes when you get into that service panel and you've got to put a double pole breaker in and you want to be as far away from the main as possible, there's no room. You know, the breaker bar is completely full. You know, it was installed sometime in the 60s and it's ugly and not up to capacity. And if I said, and we run into this all the time, telling the homeowner, all right, we need probably what you want to do is replace that service panel. Well, that tends to run about $2,500 to get an electrician in just to replace that, to upgrade the service panel. So having this little utility disconnect out here is a good deal. It's really nice to do. And it's probably going to be required now that when you do a major renovation of a home or whatever, you usually have to bring it up to code. So you might be required by your inspector or your jurisdiction to go ahead and put in one of those utility disconnect panels, even if you didn't intend on using it, just because you're making a renovation on the home. So, all right, in chapter 5, we jump in a lot about wire sizes and ampacity. I don't want to go on any further here during this session unless somebody has a specific question. But what I would encourage you to do is on page 104, there's the chart that talks about ampacities for the different types of wire. And it's important to understand wire ampacity and all of the limitations of that. So we'll start back next week on chapter 5, going over this. You know, to a certain extent, I touched on a lot of the items in chapter 5 kind of in a haphazard way, but yeah, spend some time on chapter 5 because that's sort of getting into the first meat and potatoes of what we need to understand to really install a system. So any specific questions before we call it a day? You guys are all sitting there so passively and silently. So. All right. Okay. Well, then I'll see you guys next week and I'll post the link to this video if you want to review it. Or for those folks who are not on the call, you can see it for the first time. All right. Take care. See you guys next week. And as per usual, send me an email if you have a question as you're going through. All right. Bye-bye.